I drove a train off a bridge on purpose. And if I hadn't, 9 men in the last car would have vanished forever, and no one would have asked why. My name is Harold Hal Bennett, and I've been staring at these old tracks behind me for as long as I can remember, thinking back to a day in 1967 when everything changed in a heartbeat. I still get goosebumps. By the way, if you want to ride along with the full story, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Ever since I climbed into the cab of my locomotive 16 years ago, with the throttle under my fingertips and the Westinghouse air brake at my feet, I thought I'd seen every twist and turn the rails could throw at me. But that morning felt different from the moment I glanced at the train register in Cincinnati and saw 9 names crossed out in ink. Names of men who didn't have tickets and sure as hell weren't meant to reach Philadelphia alive. I can still hear the click of the signal lever when my old friend at the siding whispered through the radio, "They're running a secret experiment, Hal. Don't say I ever told you." I'll never forget that day. Man, it was crazy how quiet the night air was, like the world was holding its breath. As the miles slipped beneath my wheels, my mind wandered back to Korea, to the orders I followed when I shouldn't have, to the faces of boys I couldn't save. And you know, that memory hit me hard, because I realized I was about to carry more than cargo. I was hauling lives that someone had marked for oblivion. My heart pounded when I reached the signal tower east of Lancaster and saw the switch set for the old metal bridge. The gauge lights blinked green, but my soul screamed red. I eased off the throttle, felt the engine's pulse slow, and engaged the cutoff lever on the rear coupler to isolate the last 3 cars. For a split second, the cab was pure silence. No click, no whistle, just the hum of oak beams and rivets ahead. In that moment, I knew there was no going back. I leaned forward, eyes fixed on the rails dipping toward the Conestoga's black water, and I made the choice no engineer ever wants to admit. I drove that train off the bridge. The front locomotive held its grip. The cars behind it plunged into the river like stones. To be honest, I still close my eyes at night and see that cascade of steel. I'm not a hero. I'm a man who finally refused to be silent. Today at 77, I live quietly in Appalachia, tending my tomato vines and watching old steamers rust away. I never touch a throttle anymore, never climb aboard another engine. But when the wind whispers through these abandoned rails, I remember every heartbeat, every choice, and I remember the faces in those black suitcases, nameless but human in my eyes. You'll see how it all unfolded. Every signal light, every heartbeat stop, every moral crossroad. Stick around, because what comes next might just make you question where you draw the line. I grew up in a small coal dust town in western Pennsylvania, the kind of place where the whistle of a passing freight train was part of your morning alarm and the last song you heard at night. My father worked the mines and my mother cleaned houses downtown. Neither had much patience for idle hands, so by the time I was 14, I'd already learned to grease wheel bearings and sweep ash from the firebox of the old steam engine we kept on the siding behind our backyard. That was my first real taste of power and responsibility. Feeling the heat of that boiler, smelling the kerosene, hearing the iron wheels click over the rails. I took to it like a moth to a flame. There was something honest about those rails, a promise that no matter how rough life got in the valley, the train would roll on, mile after mile into the wide world beyond. By the time I turned 18, I'd punched my ticket as a trainee fireman on the Cincinnati line, waking before dawn to polish the brass throttle and inspect the rods, then leaning into that throttle like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to hope. I've spent 16 years behind the controls of passenger locomotives, seeing the country unfold in steel ribbons. Ohio's rolling farmland, the smoky hills of West Virginia, the bustling streets of Cincinnati and beyond. I never fancied myself a talker. I learned early that out here you show your worth through labor, through quiet competence. Folks called me Hal or the Irishman because of my accent. But I never minded. It reminded me of my roots, of the stories my grandmother told me in her lilting brogue about grandfathers who sailed across the Atlantic, hungry for a new life. And I like to think I carried a bit of that resilience in my bones. My colleagues knew me as the man with the stern gaze but a steady hand. I wasn't prone to idle chatter in the break room, but I'd always crack a small smile for the rookie who asked a sensible question or shared a well-told tale from his first run. There was a rhythm to my days. Pre-trip inspections at 5:30, coffee at the diner across from the rail yard, radio checks with dispatch, then hours spent coasting through the countryside with nothing but the clickety-clack of the rails for company. I learned to read the weather in the steam and to read people in their silence. Some engineers thrived on the roar of the turbine, but I took comfort in the hum of the machinery, in the fact that every gauge had a story to tell if you knew how to listen. When I wasn't on duty, I'd wander those tracks with my camera, black and white shots of steel bridges arching over misty rivers, abandoned whistle posts leaning into the grass, and the way shadows pooled beneath the rails at dusk. I wasn't a sentimental man by nature, but every photograph felt like a confession, a bookmark in my memory of places that had shaped me. I remember thinking back then that this life would carry me through anything: marriage, loss, the ghosts of war. After all, I'd been to Korea in my early 20s, seen how fragile human plans could be when a single bullet upset the ledger. But nothing prepared me for the burden of knowing there were passengers on my train who weren't meant to survive the journey. Passengers who carried secrets older than those rails I walked every evening. That silent understanding between man and locomotive, that ancient pact of trust, was all I ever needed until that one day when duty to humanity outweighed the duty written in my logbook. And that's where my story really begins. It was a clear spring morning in April of 1967, and I was rolling eastbound out of Cincinnati, the sky a pale wash of dawn light spilling over the horizon. I remember the air felt heavy with promise. After weeks of rain, the rails finally dried enough for good speed, and I'd been looking forward to seeing the Ohio River gleam in the sunrise. My fireman, Pete Sullivan, was in his 20s and fresh off probation. He shuffled into the cab with his coffee thermos, nodding in greeting but too respectful to start talking much. Down in the coach yard, our conductor, Mary Cortez, was finishing her paperwork. She was sharp as a tack, one of the few women in the region with her certification, and she glanced up at the locomotive's number plate as if it carried every secret of the rails. We ran this passenger route twice a week from Cincinnati to Philadelphia, and everybody knew their station. I handled the throttle and the radio calls. Mary managed the manifests and passenger issues. Pete tended the firebox and kept an eye on our steam pressure. That morning, though, something felt off the moment I heard the scratch of ink on the train register. 9 names were crossed out with a firm, almost clinical hand, and beneath them was a notation: unregistered extra cars. My stomach knot tightened when Mary clicked her tongue and said, "Hal, did you see this?" 9 extras, no tickets. Dispatch didn't mention any unscheduled pickups. I shrugged it off. Mistakes happened at the yard, but Pete frowned and asked, "Should we call it in?" I told him to hold off until Lancaster. The line's quiet until we hit the Appalachians, and I wanted to check twice before stirring horns. As we rolled past the edge of Ohio into western Pennsylvania, the world outside became a blur of budding green hills and farmhouses blinking open their shutters. The radio crackled, dispatch confirming our departure, nothing unusual. And then 40 minutes out of Lancaster, I heard a voice I'd known since I was a green fireman. Frankie O'Donnell, the signalman at the east siding, joking about his new fishing boat. But beneath the banter was a tension I recognized. Frankie paused, then said, "Hal, you ever hear of MK Ultra?" My hand froze on the throttle. Frankie chuckled nervously, then leaned close to the mic. "They're running tests in the last cars, man. No IDs, just 9 men in their black cases. They're heading where nobody comes back." My heart started to pound so loud I could almost hear it over the engine's roar. I stared at the mirror in the cab and saw Pete's reflection, eyebrows raised. Mary peered over her clipboard, concern in her eyes. In that split second, the hum of the rails felt like it was slipping out from under me. I thought of Korea, where I'd followed orders without question until I saw what secrets were buried in camp files. I remembered the faces of men who trusted the system and paid the price. When Frankie signed off, leaving us with nothing but static, I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. This run wasn't about passengers anymore. It was about people someone had deemed expendable. So my fingers drifted over the control panel, and I felt that trigger pull in my mind. Do I stay the engineer who follows every signal, or do I become the man who decides that some orders are worse than death? The morning sun pooled on the dashboard, and I realized I had 40 minutes until the metal bridge over the Conestoga. 40 minutes to decide whether to go through with the plan I hadn't yet dared to voice. With Pete's quiet gaze and Mary's anxious glances, the cab felt smaller than it ever had. Outside, the world moved forward on iron rails. Inside, everything was at a standstill. And in that silence, I understood. I couldn't let those men ride into darkness. My story didn't begin with the crash. It began right then, in the hush before the storm. The moment I flipped that switch on the coupler and felt the hiss of air sealing off the last cars, I thought I had it all figured out. But man, I was wrong. Just 15 miles east of Lancaster, the first sign of trouble rolled in with a crackle on the radio followed by dispatch's clip voice. Caution Bennett, track inspection report delayed. Expect possible debris near Conestoga Bridge. My blood ran cold. Debris? I'd already set my plan in motion. I'd slowed the locomotive, shifted the points for the bypass, and isolated those cars. Now I had to keep everything on schedule long enough for the front engine to clear the bridge. No one was supposed to know what was coming. No one but me, and now maybe dispatch, who could send someone out after us at any moment. I glanced at Mary, her pen frozen above the manifest. Pete's hand hovered over the firebox lever, as if he half expected sparks to shoot out. In that instant, I realized I had traded certainty for chaos. The rails ahead suddenly felt like a gauntlet. I leaned forward, throttling back to maintain just enough speed to stay on course without warning the higher-ups. Trouble is, rail inspections in this part of the line weren't unusual. Rock slides from the hills, fallen tree limbs after storms, that sort of thing. But this time, I couldn't afford an emergency stop. Every jolt of the engine, every squeal of metal on metal, turned my gut into a knot. My heart hammered so loud I could almost hear Pete's pulse syncing with mine. Moments later, the radio crackled again, and a new voice, stern, unfamiliar, demanded our estimated time of arrival at Conestoga. I swallowed hard, fingers tight around the throttle. ETA in 20 minutes, I responded, forcing calm into my voice. But inside, I felt like a runner tripping on his shoelace just before the finish line. Then came the unexpected. Just as we approached the switch for the bypass, the signal light glowed yellow, caution, and refused to clear. My stomach dropped. I hammered the radio button. Signal east siding, showing caution at bypass switch. Over. Static. Nothing. No acknowledgement. The bypass track was old, seldom used, and I'd counted on the signalman to hold the logic. Now the switch stayed in its default position, pointing toward the main line and the bridge. I pounded the lever, but the mechanical lock wouldn't budge. Sweat dripped down my temple as I weighed my options. If I forced the switch manually, I'd have to jump down trackside, disabling it by hand, and hope the front locomotive didn't barrel over the bridge moments later. That would be suicide. If I backed up to find another siding, I'd waste precious minutes and risk someone seeing me tampering with the cars. And if I did nothing, those men in the last cars would ride straight onto the bridge with me, following on their heels. My mind flashed back to Mess Hall B, Korea, when I'd hesitated before raising my rifle at a fence full of civilians. Hesitated and realized the cost of blind obedience. I couldn't hesitate now. I leaned into the mic again. Frankie, are you there? Bypass switch refuses. Need manual release. Radio silence. My throat went dry. Pete's eyes met mine. Silent question in his gaze. Mary shut her notebook, crunching the pages under her palm. I felt their weight, their unspoken fear, and it hit me just how alone I was. To be honest, I wanted to shove the radio aside and walk away. I wanted to pretend this was just another run, another shift, and nothing dark was hidden in those cars. But I knew better. With a determined exhale, I killed the engine's power and reversed the throttle just enough to ease the train back a few yards. Every inch felt like wading through molasses. The rails rattled angrily under the wheels, as if protesting my plan. When I finally limped forward again, the switch clicked free at last, and the signal light flickered to green. Relief slammed into me so hard I nearly blacked out. I snapped the throttle forward, and we swung onto the bypass track, the locomotive's wheels grinding against old bolts and rusted ties. In that moment, adrenaline surged through every vein, and I realized the worst wasn't over. A bigger dilemma had formed. Now that I'd diverted the cars, how would I explain their disappearance when this was all over? Would someone follow the wreckage downstream? Would someone ask why the train's cargo was decoupled without protocol? The storm was just beginning, and I knew that after the roar of the crash, the quiet questions would cut even deeper. When we hit the final approach to the Conestoga Bridge, my hands were shaking so badly I almost missed the throttle notch I'd set. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Man, in that moment, every gauge light, every rivet in the steel girders above the rushing water felt like it was staring right at me, daring me to back down. I leaned forward, voice low into the radio. "Last call, Frankie. This is it." No answer, just static. The cab was stifling, sweat pooling in the small of my back as Pete and Mary held tight to anything solid. I could smell the hot axle grease, the varnish on the dashboard, and the faint tang of ozone from the overhead catenary. I'll never forget that day. The click of the switch, the hum of the traction motors building torque, the faint whistle of wind against the windshield. I eased the throttle open, feeling the locomotive gather momentum, and I watched the rearview mirror as the three unregistered cars crawled onto the less-used bypass track. Their wheels clattered over the old switch points, sparks flying in the dim tunnel of girders. There was a split second when I thought the whole plan was going too smoothly, too easy, and a cold dread squeezed my heart. In that moment, I realized that controlling steel and steam is one thing, but controlling fate is another. I glanced back again and saw shadowy shapes through the window of the last car, just silhouettes against the afternoon sun. I didn't know who they were, what experiments they'd faced, but I knew they deserved a chance, even if it was just a chance to float downstream rather than be ground into pulp on the far side of that bridge. With a deep breath, I slammed the brakes on the bypass line. The cars behind me groaned as their momentum stalled, rust-coated wheels screeching in protest. Then I flipped the isolation switch, cutting air to their brake line, and the emergency brakes clamped on. I could feel the locomotive tremble under me, as if it understood I was asking it to do something impossible. Mary pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes wide, and Pete looked like he was going to be sick. I ignored them. I leaned into the controls, bypassed the safety interlocks, and threw the big lever that sent the three cars rolling off the bridge. I held my breath as they teetered on the edge, then tipped forward into the Conestoga's churning waters with a crash so loud it felt like the world itself had fractured. For a moment after, there was nothing but an echo. Metal hitting water, wood splintering, the river swallowing sound like a beast. My cab felt impossibly still, every gauge light blinking in the silence, every instrument waiting for me to say what to do next. My heart hammered in my ears and I tapped the radio, voice barely above a whisper. "They're down. All clear." No response. I closed my eyes and thought of Korea, of orders I'd followed without question, and I realized that for once, I'd broken my chain of command to do what was right. The moment passed, and I threw the reverser into emergency, pulling us back onto the main line. The locomotive lurched, wheels spinning, but we held. I looked at Mary, tears in her eyes, and Pete, who managed a nod so slight I almost missed it. Out the windshield, the bridge loomed behind us, empty save for twisted metal hanging over the river. The morning sun glinted off the water, red as the dawn of something new. I don't know how I held it together after that. My hands were numb, my voice gone. But I radioed dispatch with a calm I didn't feel. "Hal Bennett, engine 302, proceeding." They sent an acknowledgement, never asking why the last three cars were missing. And in that fracture between orders and conscience, I found myself. No longer just an engineer, but a man who refused to let silent victims vanish without a trace. That was the moment I knew I'd crossed a line, and I'd never go back. After the crash, there was an eerie calm that settled over everything. The steel girders of the bridge hung empty, as if nothing had ever rolled across them. I shut down the engine and climbed down from the cab, my legs unsteady and my lungs burning with every breath. Mary and Pete followed, their faces pale but resolute, and together we stared at the river where the last three cars had disappeared. No rescue teams arrived, no frantic calls, no flashing lights, just the slow swirl of the Conestoga carrying broken metal and unanswered questions downstream. In the days that followed, I was called in for endless debriefings that felt like interrogations. "What happened to the last cars?" they asked, their eyes hawkish behind polished desks. I told them the official line: worn switchgear, faulty inspection, human error. They nodded gravely, accepted my report, and closed their folders. The press ran a brief headline about a minor derailment and then moved on to more sensational stories. No one dug into the unregistered passengers or the whispered rumors of government experiments. It was as if I'd pulled off the rails of history itself and no one even noticed. A week later, I was escorted off the railroad property with a terse memo stating retirement due to age and humanitarian concerns. In plain English, they told me to go home and never speak of the incident again. I left Cincinnati for good, carrying nothing but my engineer's cap and a weathered logbook filled with miles I'd never erase. I settled in Appalachia, near an old water tower in a field that refused to grow anything but wild grass. I built a small cabin with my own 2 hands, painted the siding a muted green, and planted tomato vines in the cleared patch beside it. Tending those plants taught me patience. I learned that growth could come slowly, in spite of everything, and that some things, like hope, were worth waiting for. I worked nights as a security guard at a small mill, walking the perimeter under a sky blazing with stars. I never steered another train. I didn't even own a car. My world contracted to the rhythm of my boots on gravel and the soft rustle of vines in the wind. Some nights I'd sit on my porch with a thermos of tea, staring down the abandoned tracks that ran past my property. They were overgrown now, tangled with brush and memories I couldn't leave behind. I'd close my eyes and hear the clickety-clack of wheels, the hiss of steam, the murmur of 9 silent men traveling toward a fate I refused to accept. Over the years, a few old colleagues reached out. Pete kept in touch by postcard, writing about his family back in Ohio. Mary moved on to dispatch work until she retired and opened a cafe where railroad memorabilia lined the walls. Every so often, someone would ask me about that day, casting a cautious glance at my lined face. I'd smile, shake my head, and say, "Just another day on the rails." They believed me because the truth was too heavy to carry. Now at 77, I still rise with the sun, tend my tomatoes, and watch the world inch forward. Sometimes I wander out to the water tower at dusk and let the breeze carry my thoughts downstream. I think of those men in the black cases, who they were, what they carried, and whether their families ever wondered where they disappeared to. I don't know the answer, and I suspect I never will. But I do know that the choice I made that day saved at least one set of eyes from staring into the dark without a chance to blink. So that's how it ended. For them, for me, and for the tracks I left behind. The world moved on, trains resumed their runs, and secrets stayed buried in official reports. I traded my badge for a pair of gardening gloves, and every blossom feels like a small act of defiance against silence. I may never have answers, but I have my conscience, and sometimes that's enough. To be honest, after that day, I felt like I'd been hollowed out from the inside. I walked away from the wreckage carrying relief and guilt in equal measure, like 2 heavy satchels I couldn't unload. For weeks, I dreamed of clattering wheels and the splash of steel into the river, waking with my heart racing, convinced I could still hear the hiss of escaping air. Some mornings, I'd sit on the porch with my tea, hands trembling as I watched the sunrise, wondering if I'd done the right thing or if I'd betrayed every rule I ever swore by. And yet, every time that doubt crept in, I'd remember the faces of those nameless men, ghosts in black cases who never had a chance otherwise. And I'd find a measure of peace knowing I gave them at least that much. Over the years, I learned that living with a secret like mine means embracing solitude. I found myself pulling away from friends who couldn't fathom why I'd risk everything for strangers, from family who said the railroad was my life, and I'd thrown it all away. I stopped talking about the rails, about engines, about my past. I even stopped wearing my engineer's cap. Instead, I poured my energy into small routines, tending my tomato vines, patrolling the mill grounds at night, listening to the wind in the trees. And in those quiet moments, I discovered what it means to carry a conscience unshaken by time. My worldview shifted in ways I never expected. I used to believe in the infallibility of orders, the unquestionable authority of those in charge. After that bridge, I learned that sometimes the moral path runs counter to every protocol etched in steel and ink. I found myself speaking up more, defending the underdog at the diner, questioning my fellow guards when they turned a blind eye, offering a listening ear to anyone weighed down by doubt. I'm not a preacher or a hero. I'm just a man who learned that doing nothing is the real crime. Now, decades later, the memory still stirs something deep in me. A reminder that one decision can tip the scales between silence and survival. Some nights I sit out by the water tower, the same one where I used to watch trains pass, and I feel the wind carry my questions downstream. Was it enough? Did it matter? And then I close my eyes and listen for an answer in the rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. Sometimes I think I hear a whisper, "You did right." And for that, I keep tending my garden, keep walking these old rails in my mind, and keep believing that even the quietest choices can echo through a lifetime. I learned that obedience only carries weight when it's guided by conscience. In those moments on the bridge, I realized that rules and orders, even those written in steel and ink, are fragile when weighed against human lives. It taught me that courage isn't loud declarations or grand heroics. It's the quiet choice to act when every protocol insists you stay silent. I discovered that saving one life, or even giving someone the chance to live, rather than disappear into a secret report, is worth every risk and sacrifice. Since then, I've carried that lesson into every corner of my life. I speak up for people who can't speak for themselves, even when it's easier to look away. I've learned to trust the small voice inside, the one that tells you when something's wrong, even if everyone else disagrees. And I've come to understand that integrity isn't something you earn by following orders. It's something you prove by standing alone when no one else will. Looking back, I know I didn't have to ride that train off the bridge to learn this. Everyday decisions can shape who we are. But that day crystallized for me the power of a single choice. It reminded me that our real duty isn't to systems or hierarchies, but to each other. And that sometimes the heaviest cargo we carry isn't steel or passengers, but the weight of what we refuse to ignore. In the years after that day, the story of Engine 302's miracle bypass quietly drifted through the rail yards like a whispered legend. Among the old-timers, it was spoken of in knowing glances and half-finished tales. Nobody ever mentioned names, but everyone understood the unspoken courage it took to defy protocol for a higher purpose. New engineers coming up in the ranks would hear about a certain run east of Lancaster, where a veteran machinist somehow kept his locomotive safe while redirecting unseen cars to an unmarked fate. They'd lean forward in the lounge car, eyes wide, imagining steel and steam as instruments of salvation rather than destruction. For me, the legend never felt like glory. It was more like a question pressed into my back every time I thought about climbing aboard. I never heard of another assignment that carried the same moral weight. No more secret passengers, no more coded orders that demanded silence. In the dispatch logs, everything returned to routine: scheduled maintenance, track inspections, manifest checks. But in the quiet corners of that network of steel, I could sense a shift. Engineers began to speak up when manifests didn't add up. Conductors alerted dispatch to unlisted cars, and signalmen hesitated before passing along orders that felt off. My silent stand became a subtle spark for countless small acts of vigilance. I never went back to the cab, but I stayed connected through postcards and the occasional reunion over coffee at the old diner by the yard. Pete married and raised kids who now ask about Grandpa's crazy railroad stories, and Mary built her cafe into a community hub where retired railroaders swap worn caps and patchwork memories. They carry my story forward, turning it into a lesson. Systems run on trust, but trust only works when you're willing to question it. Occasionally, a young engineer will approach me, eyes flickering with cautious curiosity, and ask, "Is it true you did what they said couldn't be done?" I'll nod slowly and say, "I did what I had to do." Their faces soften, and I see a flicker of something, determination maybe, or relief that someone went first. That's when I know my choice didn't end on the bridge. It rippled out through every rail and every run that followed, reminding each of us that duty to humanity always outweighs duty to orders. I've spent decades wondering what it means to choose humanity over orders, and now I leave you with this. Every one of us faces a moment when the path laid out before us conflicts with what our conscience tells us is right. Maybe it's a decision at work, a choice in a relationship, or simply whether to speak up when silence feels easier. I want you to think about the last time you stood at a crossroads. Did you follow the rule book, or did you trust that quiet inner voice? Because the truth is, none of us knows how we'll act until that moment comes. So here's what I'm curious about. If you found yourself in my shoes, knowing you could save lives by breaking every protocol you've ever honored, would you pull that lever and watch the world shift beneath you? Or would you stay on the track because it's the safer choice? Let me know in the comments below. I promise, there are no wrong answers, only the chance to explore where your own limit lies.